All right. We're going to get into the hot button topic for the day, I think. And that is this conversation here with Sonny Hostin of The View and Coleman Hughes has really pressed a lot of buttons. I've already seen a number of videos. This time I actually did watch something before I decided to cover it. I saw a number of videos that has covered this, and there are certain things that I think are left out that I do want you to see. Now, before we get into this discussion, one thing I do want to say is that what I do want you to understand is that regardless if you agree with Sonny or Coleman, and we're really going to break this down here, at the end of the day, what you have to know is that both Sonny and Coleman are status quo. Sonny Hostin is on The View because she approves and agrees with the status quo. She represents the status quo. Coleman Hughes is a part of CNN now. I don't know if everyone knows that, but he's on CNN because, again, he fits with the status quo. If you notice, mainstream media doesn't typically give these positions to people who are outside of that status quo. So always keep that in mind. So going into this conversation, we're actually going to go to the clip from Ana Kasparian because I found a little bit of hypocrisy here with her. And we'll chime in with this clip from her because it's really telling to me. And part of this has something to do with the reason why I really had to walk away from the Bernie Sanders, politic crowd, because I don't think they fully get it. I think that Coleman and Sonny both have valid points, but I think there's more that needs to be discussed here. And I think there's also some things I've already talked about Sonny on the show numerous times. There's some things I think that you need to see about Coleman Hughes. I think you need to understand where he actually is coming from. And I think you need to see who he's aligned with, so you understand why he may have the talking points that he has. Let's go ahead and dive into this clip here.
Many in the Black community, if I'm being honest with you, because I want to be, believe that you are being used as a pawn by the right and that you're a charlatan of sorts.
He's not a Republican.
I don't think there's any evidence I've been co-opted by anyone, and I think that that's an ad hominem tactic people use to not address really the important conversations we're having here.
So we're going to touch on that. We're going to touch on that.
Author and analyst Coleman Hughes was recently met with some intense hostility, specifically from Sonny Hostin on The View, as he appeared on the show to promote his new book, The End of Race Politics: Arguments for a Colorblind America. At a time when the culture in America has essentially rejected colorblindness, instead embracing an almost obsessive focus on race and how we differ from one another, I honestly wasn't shocked that he was met with that kind of vitriol. We'll get back to that portion of the exchange in just a minute. But first, I do think it's actually important to understand Coleman as a person and the argument he's trying to make. In the interest of full disclosure, though, I do have to admit that I'm a fan of Coleman's, even though he and I have some disagreements. He's more supportive of Israel's war on Gaza, as an example. On some issues, he definitely leans to the right of me, but...
Pause. He's a little bit more than just supportive of Israel's war on Gaza. It's more than him being supportive of it. We'll get into that as well, because I'm going to show you things that Anna's not going to show you.
I actually find him to be thoughtful. He makes thought-provoking arguments in good faith. And I don't know about you, but I've been increasingly bored with shows that have default ideological talking points that hosts never deviate from. It's a mindless snooze fest. Sometimes Coleman's analysis on certain current events challenge my own, and I find that to be a good thing. We should all be willing to challenge and reevaluate our own beliefs without assuming the one challenging us is some grifter or right-wing pawn. I think it makes us smarter and mentally stronger. Now, with that out of the way, let's hear Coleman out on the direction he believes policy should go in America.
The default right now in a lot of areas of policy is to use, Black and Hispanic identity as a proxy for disadvantage. And my argument is that you actually get a better picture of who needs help by looking at socioeconomics and income. That picks out people in a more accurate way.
Okay, so let me pause here for just a second. So for those who are not aware, Coleman Hughes and Sonny are both Afro-Latino. But even though they're both Afro-Latino, they actually have very different upbringings. And I'm going to dive into that in just a little bit. I think I'll let this finish first, but I wanted to go ahead and get that out there so that you understand that, because that will be important. That's why he said Black and Latino, because he's Black and Latino. We go ahead.
Not my question, but when you say that socioeconomics picks out people in a better way than race, when you do look at the socioeconomics, you see the huge disparity between white households and Black households. You see the huge disparity between white households and Hispanic households. So your argument, and I've read your book twice because I wanted to give it a chance, your argument that race has no place in that equation is really fundamentally flawed.
All right. So let's come in here for just a second. The first thing I noticed with this conversation is that Sonny came in kind of hot, where he was more calm about the situation, but she did come in kind of hot. And I wonder if some of that has to do with their background. And that's why I bring this up again. Both of them, we'll come back to this, both of them are Afro-Latino, but they did grow up very differently. And I want to show you the difference here. So Coleman is from Montclair, New Jersey, and I actually know people from Montclair, New Jersey. Okay, suburban area, pretty well-to-do area. I'll show you here so you can see, because I wanted to bring this up. I think this is the income. If we look at Montclair, New Jersey, I just wanted to show you the diversity. Montclair, New Jersey actually has a diversity score of 97. So for people who are not aware, at one point in time, I think it was 2022, I should have this up here somewhere, 2022, Montclair, New Jersey was actually ranked as the most diverse, city in the United States. It is very diverse. I will give it that hands down. Suburbia, diverse area. And you can actually see the numbers here just to show you what you're dealing with here. 46.1% white, 12.1% Hispanic, 31.1% Black, 5.8% Asian, 0.0% Native American, and 5.0% other. It is not the norm when you compare it to other cities in the United States. It's just not. And a friend of mine grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, and she has said this as well. She said there's no other place like it from where she's lived in the United States, right? So take that into consideration. Now, I want to show you something else here as well about Montclair. Let me scroll down. Their stuff is a little small. I guess you can't do it because their stuff is small. When you look at their median income, the median income in Montclair, New Jersey is over $158,000. So that's pretty significant, I would say. I mean, I don't make $150,000. So that's pretty significant. Again, pretty well-to-do area. And then we can also take a look at the public schools in Montclair, New Jersey. Niche actually gave it an A. Right? It says Montclair Public Schools, they're highly rated. Public school district located in Montclair, New Jersey. It has like over 6,143 students in grades PK, K through 12, student to teacher ratio 14:1. So yeah, it says highly rated. So Coleman Hughes is coming from a place that is, not just diverse, very diverse, but is also suburbia and well-to-do. And he's Afro-Latino. This is the class difference from how they grew up. Sonny grew up in the Bronx. And I don't know if you've never been to the Bronx. I've been to the Bronx. One thing I can tell you is the poorest area in New York City. And it's been that way for years. For years. You can go back to that. I went back to the Bronx League recently. It does not look different compared to how it looked like 5 years ago. So I wonder if that's where some of that hostility came in from Sonny, because I think she's kind of looking at him as like, look, you and I both are Afro-Latino, but they do have very different upbringings. So it almost seemed like the class perspective, which Coleman Hughes talks about a lot, it almost seems like that really comes into play between the two of them as well. Let's go on a little bit more here.
Argument that race has no place in that equation is really fundamentally flawed.
Look, I think Sonny Hostin's lack of logic here is what's fundamentally flawed. Just keeping it real. It's somewhat strange how triggered she is by the notion that we should focus economic policies on class rather than identity like race. I assure you there are plenty of poor people of all races in America. However,
let me pause. So this is what I have to say here about Anna. I think Anna is the last person that should be talking about class politics at this point in time, considering it was just a year ago, Anna Kasparian was actually advocating for criminalizing homeless people on TYT. So I don't think she's the one that needs to talk about class. No, it just stop. Just stop. So that's the hypocrisy about it. And this is something that I did notice as time went by with a lot of the people, a lot of the Bernie movement. And I supported Bernie Sanders. I was probably one of his biggest supporters. I donated money to him. But even I had some critiques when it came to some of the policies, some of the platforms, right? So what I noticed is I think there tends to be this idea that if you mention that Black people are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, which is true, there's this idea that you're not supposed to mention that. You're not supposed to focus on that. You're just supposed to focus on the universal policies. And as I've said before on this show, those universal policies would lift all boats. But even after you lift all boats, Black people would still be at the bottom. So they were focused on equality, the Bernie campaign, instead of focusing on equity. So if we're still at the bottom, then there still needs to be something done to make that adjustment. Let's continue a little bit more here.
She herself is a wealthy woman of color, so maybe class-based issues don't appeal to her the same way as they would for the working poor in America. And while it is true that Black and Latino Americans are more economically disadvantaged on average, it's also true that class-based policies would disproportionately benefit their lives without leaving poor white Americans behind.
So you see, this is the revealing moment, because right here, Anna admits that. She admits to you that she knows that we're at the bottom. She knows that we have to deal with this more, but she's still telling you that we should just give everything universal to everybody. And here's the thing, I've said this before, I still advocate for UBI. I still support those policies. I still think everybody should have healthcare in this country. I still think we should have free public college, but there is a piece when it comes to what is missing with repair. And what is missing with repair that has been done for other groups in the United States has not been done for American descendants of slavery. And these are the type of discussions that I noticed, like Anna Kasparian and a lot of people. This is not just a conservative thing. Don't think it's just conservatives that don't want to talk about reparations. This was an issue in the progressive community as well. Bernie Sanders told you, no, he didn't agree with it. But Bernie Sanders had no problem signing off on legislation for reparations for his people. People had no problem with giving cash reparations to Japanese Americans and their descendants that were part of the internment camps. It's only when you bring up American descendants of slavery. And that's what I want you guys to pay close attention to that. So we all realize that, yes, there are class issues within this country. I acknowledge that. I've said that on the show multiple times. I talk about the people at the top. But when all these people come to you and they talk about closing the racial wealth gap, and they say things to you about canceling student loan debt or implementing baby bonds, These things have already been debunked by the data and the research, and you can see this for yourself in Dr. Darity's book. He did the research. I've interviewed him on the show. I've interviewed Marcel Dixon. There have been a number of people that have actually come on with data to break it down. So that is something to understand. When it comes to Coleman Hughes, I'm not going to go too hard on him because Coleman Hughes, he's young. He's very young. I think he's like 26 years old, right? And he has this idea of having a colorblind society. I'm not going to hate on him for that. I, at one point, felt that way. So I understand what he's saying. I understand where he's coming from. I also have been in similar position that Sunny has been in. So I understand where she's coming from. But we need to talk about how both of them have valid points instead of just these videos I saw earlier this morning, actually, which was so-and-so takes down this and stuff like that. I think they both had valid points. I will say I do think Sunny came in a little bit too hot. Like she came in hot. I'm like, just chill.
Why is that a bad thing? Don't we want to see all of our fellow Americans succeed, regardless of religion, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc.? Class-based economic policies have more buy-in among voters and tend to be harder to repeal because they're applied to everyone impacted by poverty. Coleman managed to maintain his composure, something that he's insanely skilled in, and responded, in my opinion, perfectly.
There's two separate questions. One is whether each racial group is socioeconomically the same. That I agree with you. They're not.
Yeah, they're not, and the stats show that.
But yeah, of course, I agree with that fully. The question is, how do you address that in the way that actually targets poverty the best?
Great.
And what Martin Luther King wrote in his book, Why We Can't Wait, is he called it, we need a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. And he said, yes, we should address racial inequality. Yes, we should address the legacy of slavery. But the way to do that is on the basis of class. And that will disproportionately target blacks and Hispanics because they're disproportionately poor. But
so this is the part where I have to jump in here because you see, now I'm starting to hear, when I heard this, I was like, those are similar talking points to mainstream, like mainstream media makes those same talking points when they talk about MLK. MLK also said, we're coming to get our check. I'm going to show you what MLK said in just a second. You know, so it's easy to mention that part. People also need to take into consideration that towards the end, you know, of his fight and his activism, MLK actually started to change his mind about some of the positions that he had. And he started to question some of the decisions that he made. He started to question whether or not a nonviolent approach was the right thing to do. He also said that he feared that he actually sent his people into a burning house. So we need to, when we talk about MLK, we need to make sure we talk about all of it and not just the part that mainstream media is telling you, because that's the same talking point I hear on mainstream media.
They will be doing so in a way that also helps the white poor, in a way that addresses poverty as the thing to be addressed.
He's right. I mean, I think he makes really good points there. But look, maybe Sunny Hostin has a counterpoint that we haven't even considered. So let's keep an open mind and give her a chance to respond.
You claim that color blindness was the goal of the civil rights movement, based upon Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, you know, content of character versus the color of skin. He also said in 1968, it was about less than a week before he was assassinated, this country never stops to realize that they owe a people kept in slavery for 244 years. So rather than class, he did write about that earlier on. Right before his death, he made the argument for racial equality and racial reparations. And so your argument for color blindness, I think, is something that the right has co-opted.
The quote that you just...
Pause right there for just a second, because we're going to come back to that as well. So this is the thing. We're going to talk a little bit about hypocrisy again here, right? Because Sunny is saying all this, but at the same time, Sunny, time and time again, has come onto that show and has told you to support the people that did not have a reparations plan. Sonny has told you to support Joe Biden. The people, all the candidates that had some type of reparations plan or have a reparations plan right now, Sonny is not backing those people because those people are outside of the status quo. At the end of the day, she's saying this right now because she believes that Coleman is conservative, although Coleman says he's not conservative. So she feels like I'm going to go harder towards him because it's coming from him. But at the end of the day, Sonny, you saying all that, but you didn't say that when Joe Biden was sitting in that seat. You didn't say that when Bernie Sanders was sitting in that seat. All the stuff you're talking about with repair, all the politicians that came onto the show, The View, you never brought this up. And in fact, I remember when Marianne came onto the show and she was talking about reparations, you actually were pretty nasty to her. All of you guys were nasty to her. When Andrew Yang came onto The View and he talked about UBI, all of you guys were nasty to him the first time that he came on. So it's really interesting. That's why I said there's a lot of hypocrisy here. I understand where both sides are coming from. I understand what he's saying about having this vision of a colorblind society where your race doesn't matter. Like your race shouldn't be the basis of things, where we can just look at each other as humans, but that's not the reality. But I understand where he's coming from because I used to have that same way of thinking. Sonny, I understand where she's coming from when she's saying that we're at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, so we can't just focus on class. But at the same time, when you had candidates that came on that show who actually said those things, Sonny was against those people. So to me, it's a hot mess.
Just pointed out about doing something special for the Negro. That's from the book Why We Can't Wait that I just mentioned.
Yes.
A couple paragraphs later, he lays out exactly what that something special was.
Yes.
And it was the Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged, a broad class-based policy.
But he also says you must include race.
No, he didn't. He says it's
he does.
Okay, well, everyone should go read the book Why We Can't Wait.
I gotta say, I didn't notice until this very moment, but the fact that she's rejecting class-based politics while wearing a Gucci button down and a Gucci belt is hilarious. But nonetheless,
you really don't have any room to talk, Anna, because like I said, you've been all over the place the past year and a half, and you were sitting up there saying that homeless people should be criminalized. So you don't really respect class-based politics either. Can't remember the last time I even saw you talk to someone who was working class. So get out of here with that mess. Get out of here. Get out of here with that mess. Okay. So let me break something down for you for just a second, because I want to talk about 3 different environments, because I told you that Coleman came from Montclair, New Jersey, very diverse area, suburban, good schools, etc. Sonny grew up in the Bronx. They're both Afro-Latino. We talk about race and class. I can kind of point to a little bit of my own experience. I had the experience of growing up. I've lived in a white neighborhood, predominantly white neighborhood. I lived in a very diverse area, similar to Coleman, and I've lived in an all Black neighborhood in Baltimore, Maryland. So I've had experience living in different types. Where do you think I experienced the most racism? Tell me in the chat. I'll wait. Where do you think? The diverse neighborhood, the white neighborhood, the Black neighborhood? I'll go ahead and tell you. I'm pretty sure most of you can figure this out. I experienced the most racism in the white neighborhood. Where I understand where Coleman gets his logic from is my experience growing up in the military community in Germany, overseas. I understand it because when I was in Germany, we lived in military communities. So when I was in Germany, like, I went to school with everybody. I had friends of all different races. Like, to me, I felt like this was the norm. So I had friends and classmates that were Asian, Black, white, biracial. 2 of my best friends were biracial. I didn't even realize that was like a thing until I got out of that environment. So during that time, I really did believe, people aren't racist anymore. Racism isn't an issue. And then we moved. And when we came back to the States, while my dad was getting things ready for us in North Carolina, because it was during the school year, I had to go to school. So I stayed with my grandmother while my dad was handling that stuff. And I stayed with my grandmother in Baltimore, Maryland, all Black neighborhood in the inner city. I wasn't in Beemore County, okay? So don't be like, oh, you were in the county. I was not in the county. I was in the inner city in Baltimore, Maryland, and I went to Lockham and Bundy. And that was when I started to see things differently, because I didn't realize just how good I had it. And so when I hear Coleman talk, it reminds me of how I used to feel until I got out of that environment and I had to live somewhere else. So I went from attending a Dodge school where the government paid for everything. I was able to be in all these different sports. I was in the band. I didn't have to pay for those things. The schools were nice. The cafeteria food was actually decent. Like, we had everything. To going to Lockham and Bundy in the inner city in Baltimore, where we were lucky if we had heat. All of a sudden, I started to realize I had things a lot better off than I thought I did. I had people waiting for me for school when I came home from school and telling me to do my homework. My classmates did not. Most of my classmates had single parents. These kids were raising themselves. I saw the inequality. I saw the inequities. But what I did not really have to deal with, still, even in the Black neighborhood, was the racism issue, except for when the police came in and they didn't live in the neighborhood. The Baltimore police patrolling in my grandmother's neighborhood, it was usually white cops, and they didn't live there. So I knew not to even be near the police. But I wonder how I would have felt if I never had that change of environment. I wonder if I still would have thought like Coleman Hughes. So all of a sudden I'm looking around and I see abandoned houses and kids don't have what they need. I see the school is under-resourced, underfunded. Then we moved to North Carolina. My parents bought a house in North Carolina and I went to a predominantly white school. And all of a sudden I was back at a school that had everything again. But then I had to deal with the racism. That was when I started to realize that my idea of this color blindness, a lot of people really did not feel that way. And racism in the South tends to be more overt instead of covert. So I got called all kinds of names. I think that for those of us that grew up in diverse areas, there are pros and cons to that. One of the pros is that you're introduced to all these different cultures, right? So you learn a lot from each other. You learn a lot about different cultures. One of the cons, though, could be that you could actually grow up with the perception believing that that is how the rest of the world is. And I think it's important to see how other people live. So I was sheltered. And I got a dose of reality. I used to have that mindset that like, oh, all I had to do was just work hard, do well in school, and you can get anything that you fight for. And like I said, I sat there and I remember in Baltimore, and I remember some of the kids who did work really hard still couldn't get out of poverty. And if you don't have to live through that, you don't know what it's like. Most people will never get out of poverty. Most people won't. And it's even worse when you go into the inner city Black neighborhoods where even the people who had businesses at one point can't afford to keep them because they're being bought out by other groups. Now, all of a sudden, the beauty supply store and the convenience store no longer belongs to the people in the neighborhood. This happens all across the country. I think that Sonny came in hot. Go to the next part of Type VNC, Corey. But I do want to show you something because, you know, I watched this and I've listened to Coleman before. And I've wondered to myself, why does Coleman, you know, feel this way? So I did have to look a little bit at his history, right? At his background to understand why he has this perception. And then it all started to make sense. So Coleman Hughes was actually on Black News Channel, and he was talking to Mark Lamont Hill. I want to take you back to something. There was something I noticed here. Coleman Hughes is against reparations, right? He was actually part of a panel, him and Candace Owens, and he was advocating against it. But listen to what I want you to hear. I want you to hear what he's saying about why he's against it. And that the part to me is really problematic because it's the framing. Listen to this.
You talk about it as a moral mistake as well as a political mistake. What's the moral mistake here?
The moral mistake is that obviously when the victims of a historical crime are still alive, there is a moral obligation of the perpetrators to pay reparations. When we're talking about, so for instance, it would be a morally necessary, in my opinion, as I said at the hearing, to pay reparations for Jim Crow to survivors of the Jim Crow system. Now, on the other hand, when you're talking about the median Black American being around, 35 years old or so, born in the 80s, is there a moral obligation to take money from one group of people and give it to that person for a crime that happened 200 years ago?
Pause. The problem with this conversation is the framing. And Mark Lamont Hill didn't catch this when he had the interview. I don't know if Coleman is aware of this, but I've interviewed multiple reparations activists on the show, and the framing is wrong. Reparations is not paid for by you or me. It is not paid for through taxpayer money. I don't know how many times and how many books need to be written or how many interviews need to happen for people to get this through their head. So Coleman Hughes, the message that he is delivering, and he delivered at that hearing that he's referring to, this message is incorrect. It is giving the audience the impression that they would be paying for it, that your tax dollars would pay for it. Your tax dollars don't pay for reparations. The government would pay for it. This has been explained so many different times. I don't know why. And I sat there and I watched this discussion, and Mark Lamont Hill didn't catch it. So this is another thing where people are being misinformed. They're misinformed and they're being misled. Now listen to this part.
That's a very different situation, and one in which you have to consider whether it's politically wise to do that, whether it actually serves the interests of the community that is suffering from many different problems in the present that need to be solved. To frame that solution as reparations, saying essentially blaming a group of people that don't feel connected to the crime because it was so long ago, right? So that's what I mean by a moral and political mistake.
So there's a few leaps there that I want to unpack with you for a minute. So you start by saying that it would be a morally proper thing to do if the victims of a crime were still alive. And then when we get to these people born in the 1980s, you're saying, well, if the redress comes through them, if we give it to their great-great-great-grandchildren, it produces a political sort of challenge and crisis for the community, if I understand you correctly. And it may not be the proper way to address the needs of the broader community. Understood. I hear that argument. That still doesn't address why it would be not moral to do so, right? If for example, there were a person who was enslaved and slavery ends and they have a child, just one generation, just a child who was denied access to housing, healthcare, and in general American prosperity because their parent was a slave, an enslaved African. Would you, just in that example, would you say that it would be improper to give reparations to them?
Yeah, so that I think in that case, probably it would be proper. And obviously it's a case by case basis, but the closer you are to the crime,
the more plausible and morally required it is to give somebody reparations. And you always have to take into account the other side of the equation here, right? If my grandfather does something if your grandfather did something horrible to my grandfather, I couldn't necessarily come to you and expect you to pay me directly, right? That would be immoral. So obviously, the closer you are to the crime, you're exactly right. The more necessary, the more morally required it is, and it's a damn shame that reparations were not paid to recently freed slaves and their children. Unfortunately, it is a different situation we're dealing with today. And
so we got to come in here for a second, because you see, it was paid to other groups. So the question that I would have for Coleman, because I know that he's pro-Israel, the question that I would have for Coleman, what would he say? Let's go ahead and pull this up here and I'll bring up the other one. What would he say about what Kathy Hochul just did? What would he say about this? This just happened. New York has secured over $183 million in compensation for Holocaust victims and their heirs. Hate has no home in New York, and my administration is committed to uplifting survivors and their families while honoring the memory of 6 million lives taken far too soon. This was January of this year. So would Coleman Hughes reject Kathy Hochul giving more compensation to Holocaust victims? I don't think he would, because if he would, I don't think Barry Weiss would still be aligned with him. You'll see that in just a second. We go on here to say, this is what people are bringing this up. Look at this. Here's Nico. Did the U.S. actively participate in the Holocaust? If not, why are you paying for the damages you didn't cause? Why haven't you shown the same urgency when it comes to reparations for Black people who have not only been harmed by reverberating impact of slavery, but even the policies that followed thereafter? Good point. Here's Roger Meadows. That reparations bill that you did was for a study. How is it that they get a check, but we get a study? There we go again. I told you. See, look, here's JB. So reparations, I mean, y'all literally got rid of Seneca Village to put in Central Park in NYC. Just because New York isn't a southern state, that doesn't mean y'all didn't participate or profit off of slavery. A debt is owed, Catherine. So you see the this is what I was trying to tell you guys. This is the hypocrisy. So would Coleman Hughes reject that? Would Coleman Hughes go participate in a hearing to push back on that? Probably not, because it's for a different group of people. These kind of things we need to pay close attention to. I told you guys before, I've been taking notes, and I'm seeing a lot of these Zionists, what they have done is they are propping up Black faces who actually already are against things for our community. You notice this? Pay attention. Pay attention. Now, I really do believe that Coleman does feel this way. I believe that he actually does believe this. But what I'm saying is, if you notice, this guy's everywhere. He's a political analyst at CNN. Okay? They don't take just anybody. They take people who are going to maintain the status quo. And they've also hired a lot of Zionists. So pay close attention to those things. Why do you think this guy is everywhere? On mainstream media. I'm not talking about independent media. Mainstream media. Why do you think that is? Think about it, folks. Have you seen them invite, and we're going to bring up Bree here in just a second. Have you seen Bree on The View? Have you seen Bree on The Breakfast Club? Outside of Bernie Sanders' campaign, have you seen Bree on CNN? No, you haven't. There are certain people that they bring forward. This piece here, I also want to show you, because Bree actually interviewed Coleman. I want you to hear what he said here in reference to race and class. Listen to this.
Politically, I'm an independent. I've only voted twice for president, and I voted both times for Hillary and for Biden for Democrats, mainly because I did not like Trump.
Oh, fascinating! I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so I'm not actually a Republican. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, and a lot of my views on race and racial inequality would be categorized as conservative. So in that sense, I accept that label. But
so he accepts the conservative label, but he's an independent. And I did want to mention this part because I'm noticing some of the news articles, they do define him as a conservative. So I did want to take you back to this discussion that he had with Bree, where he explained he was an independent. But listen to this.
Yeah, I didn't really come to politics by thinking about it as liberal versus conservative. I came to it from a philosophy background mainly. And so, basically I was a person that didn't really care very much about race or didn't think very much about race growing up. I grew up in a very diverse liberal suburb of New York, and I had friends of every race, but I mainly connected to people on the basis of our shared interests, like music or anything like that. And then I got to Columbia University, and suddenly, every week in the student newspaper, someone was writing about how they experienced racism on campus, in one of the most progressive, subcultures that exists on Earth. And there was this general, new to me, kind of hysteria and hyperventilation about white supremacy, which felt very strange to me because it didn't capture my reality, it didn't capture what I was seeing day to day. And I became very curious. Why is it that people are hyperventilating about white supremacy and racism in a way that seems to me to be irrational and unconnected from reality? That's when I became really curious, and I applied my brain and my love of philosophy, and I started reading voraciously people like Glenn Lowry, who has been on this podcast, who is a hero of mine, John McWhorter and others, and found that the explanations that they gave about race and racial inequality, from many of these people are Black conservatives. Thomas Sowell, probably the greatest Black conservative writer of the 20th century. Their general viewpoints on the matter appealed to me much more than what I was being told from most of Black liberal writers, progressive writers, and certainly most other professors, writers, and elites on campus.
What about their writings appealed to you?
It seemed more connected to reality. It seemed to accept the basic fact of how much progress has been made in reducing racism in this country. If I talk to my grandfather about what it was like to grow up during Jim Crow, he's astounded at the life that I'm able to lead. I remember a couple months ago, he visited me and he saw me at a table, just like socializing effortlessly with white people. And he comes up to me after and he goes, "It's amazing to me that's just so easy for you, because you just didn't, growing up, you could not cross the color line in my day." And so when I hear the way that racism is talked about in America on the left right now, you could go for a pretty long time without hearing anyone acknowledge that more than a little progress has been made, that a lot of progress has been made.
So let me just jump in here for just a second. So I, for one, don't think I'm one of those people that said there's been no progress made. I've talked about progress that has been made, but it's kind of clear to me that I think Coleman is touching on overt racism and not talking about covert racism. Are there some people that will exaggerate and make it seem like every day I walk outside my door, I'm faced with racism every day, or someone yells something at me? Yeah, I mean, that's extreme. That does not happen to me every day, obviously. But there are different forms. There's structural racism, there's systemic racism. But more commonly, what we tend to deal with in the Northeast, and it's interesting that Coleman isn't mentioning this because he lives in the Northeast as well, is covert racism. That's what we usually have to deal with here. In the South, people are a little bit more direct. They'll just call you these things to your face. They tell you exactly how you feel. You know what you are going to get. In the Northeast, it's done in a different way. And you have to deal with racism when it comes to real estate. And as someone who has gone through the home buying process, I know what that is like. So I'm going to be very clear and real with you. These things do exist. I think Coleman would like to have a colorblind society. I wish we lived in a society where it didn't matter and where everybody could just look at each other as human beings and not have a prejudice about you because of the color of your skin. But that is not the world that we live in. And that was something that I had to come to understand when I was young. So I get what he's saying, but we cannot sit here and pretend like these incidents, and it's not just a one-off of police brutality. It's the structural things that are in place. It's the criminal justice system, how obviously a Black person and a white person can have the same record and the Black person gets more time. It's that. It's employment, where it's been proven time and time again that obviously if you have a name that doesn't sound as Black, people are usually surprised to see me and see that I look like me. People are surprised especially if they talk to me on the phone. A lot of times they'll assume that I'm a white woman. And especially if they see my last name. Salvati is my married name. So people assume that when I walk in for an interview, they assume they're going to talk to a white woman. And I can always tell, I see the surprise on their face when I walk in and they're like, oh, right. So there are different things that we do deal with in this country. And I think that in an ideal world, we could have something like what Coleman's talking about. But until we fix these issues with the structural racism, and we fix these issues with systemic racism, and then you have to pay the debt that is owed. There has to be a cause for repair. And I think with Coleman, and you'll see this when we get to the Barry Weiss situation with Coleman, my question for you would be, in reference to that type of repair, do you think it was unfair for Germany to pay reparations to Jewish people? Do you think that should not have happened? Do you disagree with Kathy Hochul paying reparations right now? This is new. It also happened under Barack Obama. Do you disagree with that? Or do you only disagree with it when it applies to American descendants of slavery? Did you disagree with it when reparations were paid to Japanese Americans that were part of the internment camps and their descendants? Because part of the reason why, and someone who lived in Germany, part of the reason why they were able to come to a place of healing is because they did make repair. We never healed in this country. We never healed from that. People here haven't healed from Jim Crow. People mention slavery. Let's talk about Jim Crow. That wasn't that long ago. My parents were alive during Jim Crow. I'm the first person in my family to go to an integrated school. Let that sink in. This wasn't that long ago. There was no healing because there was no repair. Then there was redlining. Then there was the New Deal, which discriminated against Black people and Indigenous people. Then there's the housing racism. So there have been multiple things that have happened, since slavery. It's not just about slavery, Coleman. So that's my question. And I asked that question because this Z Squirrel account on Twitter is on it. I think it's important to understand where Coleman comes from. Because like I said, and I think the Oracle said it, but why is his voice being amplified? You're about to see why. So Z Squirrel actually did a little bit of digging, and I think people need to see this. Coleman Hughes worked for the Manhattan Institute, a Zionist propaganda mill founded by Reagan's CIA director until very recently when he finally got his cherished CNN gig, and now also writes for Barry Weiss Rag also funded by Zionist billionaires. But he says he's independent. So I will add this to give Coleman the benefit of the doubt. At the time when he got the job at the Manhattan Institute, he probably did not know those things about the Manhattan Institute. Maybe he didn't know who the founder was. This happens all the time. People don't dig that far deep. Maybe he didn't know. But it could explain why his voice is being amplified. Look at this. So Jules actually took a screenshot of this here. There's no evidence that I've been co-opted by anyone. I have an independent podcast. I work for CNN as an analyst. I write for the Free Press. I'm independent in all these endeavors, and no one is paying me to say what I'm saying. Well, people don't necessarily have to pay you to say what you're saying, but when you are saying certain things, there are certain people that will amplify you. And I'm getting really tired of people saying that because they have an independent podcast that there's no issue here that they work at CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. And if you were one, if we're going to be fair, if you were one to criticize Sam Cedar when he worked at MSNBC, you should be holding that same criticism towards Coleman Hughes working at CNN. If we are going to be fair, it's mainstream media, and mainstream media doesn't amplify, and they don't hire people, all right, that are on the outside, that are not a part of the status quo. Here's the picture here from the Manhattan Institute. So that's what Z Squirrel was referring to there. And it does say it right here. The Manhattan Institute was founded by former CIA Director William J. Casey in 1978. So again, Z Squirrel was correct about that. Keep in mind, this is the same account that actually discovered that the New York Times journalist that wrote about the sexual assault claims on October 7th, that person wasn't actually a journalist. This was the account that uncovered all of that stuff. They go on to say, unsurprisingly, given that Coleman Hughes got all his funding from Zionist billionaires who made him a millionaire and gave him his media spotlight and CNN gig. After October 7th, he went on podcasts like Joe Rogan to launder genocidal Zionist propaganda for his AIPAC paymasters. And if you see the screenshot here, it says Coleman Hughes to Joe Rogan. I saw this interview, by the way. Hamas is a death cult. Israel is the good guy and Hamas is the evil guy. So Coleman Hughes repeating Zionist propaganda. And if you can see, it doesn't let me zoom in on a picture, but if you can see here, the people who are actually commenting here, it says, stand with us. That's a Zionist account. This one here, Armiro Singart, that's also a Zionist account. KK Brunetta, Zionist. Madam Splint. You see this? So we always got to ask ourselves, why are these people being elevated in mainstream media? Z Squirrel goes on to say Coleman Hughes particularly loves identity politics as he brands himself as anti-woke, following the lead of other Zionists like his boss, Barry Weiss. Having gleefully sold his black skin to his Zionist paymasters, he uses it to launder their genocidal propaganda. So let's just keep it real. We all know Barry Weiss is a Zionist. Barry Weiss isn't going to hire someone like Coleman Hughes if he's pro-Palestine. See how they use black faces to, I told you this was happening. And there's a screenshot of the article here. Coleman Hughes, the struggle for black freedom has nothing to do with Israel. This is him. This is him. Let's go on here. They go on to say, oh, so you don't believe Israel is not an apartheid regime. Here's the black guy, Coleman Hughes, we bought telling you it isn't. Listen to him. He's black. Meanwhile, here is the head of Israel's own Tessalem human rights organization saying Israel is an apartheid regime. That is exactly what they do. They find someone who is black that is going to parrot that same narrative. So then you really got to believe what they say because it's a black person saying it. It's not an Israeli saying it. It's not a white person saying it. This is important, people. I'm trying to show you how they work. There's nothing Zionists love more than buying black people and other minorities to mouth and launder their genocidal Zionist propaganda for them so they can hide behind them and say, see, they're saying it too. Richie Torres, Chloe Valdery, Bakari Sellers, and Coleman Hughes. You see what they do, guys? They got Richie Torres. They got Chloe Valdery. See this? They got, that's Chloe too. They got Bakari Sellers. So you see how they do this? I told you. Goes on here to say, it's astonishing how easily Z Squirrel called him scum. I wouldn't go that far. Coleman Hughes, pure fabrications of right-wing Zionist media class and the billionaires that fund it brand themselves as independent, anti-Eid free speech lovers when they are Zionist maniacs. Look at him tap dancing for his masters. And he goes on, it's a screenshot here. I can personally say that I consciously worked less hard in high school because I knew my blackness would give me a big boost come admission time. I doubt I was peculiar in that respect. Please respond to incentives. I can't vouch for the other stories. So he said he worked less hard, but he got into Columbia University. So here it is here. It gets more insane. For Barry Weiss Zionist propaganda rag, Coleman Hughes wrote a piece denying George Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin. This was on tape, went to court, but Barry says, no, not enough evidence for me. He's innocent. Believe Israeli women. So you see how, and they are parroting the same talking points. So again, she's not going to hire someone to work at her outlet that's not parroting the same talking points that she's going to parrot. She sure as hell wasn't going to hire someone that's like free Palestine or anything like that. So, and then they go into more details about how crazy and wild Barry Weiss is. So this piece here from Indy Left from Indie News Network. Corporate funded independent media has been creeping up for a while now. People need to be super wary and understand the business dealings of the people they listen to so they understand the financial motives, if any, behind their rhetoric. Thank you so much for saying that, Indie Left. Thank you for saying that. Because there's a number of people, all of a sudden, all these people popping up that we're independent. And I'm like, dude, you work at CNN. We're independent. I'm like, you're on mainstream media, right? So Iraq said this, the fact that he's getting defensive about it means he knows people are onto him. It's exactly what you wrote. Zionists are hiring brown people to do the talking for them because they know the public would never accept anything they say. They've been caught lying too many times for this to be undone at this point. It really is an information war. So do I think that Coleman Hughes believes what he's saying? I actually do. I think he does believe what he's saying. And I told you about the way that he grew up, and I told you about the way that Sonny grew up. So they do have a difference there in reference to their backgrounds and stuff like that. And I can tell you from my experience as someone who I've lived in all three of those types of areas. When I grew up in a diverse area, I used to think that too. I used to think, we're a colorblind society. Let's not focus on race. Let's not deal with those things. But once I stepped outside of that environment, I realized the rest of the world was not that way. The majority of the country is not Montclair, New Jersey. The majority of the country is not a military base that I started growing up on. So I had an eye-opening experience. But whether you agree with Sonny or Coleman, at the end of the day, what really matters is that you understand that both of them are status quo and both of them are in the positions that they are in because they protect the status quo. They are not outside of that. Neither one of them is way to the left. Neither one of them is way to the right. Neither one of them are telling you to get rid of the billionaires. In fact, Coleman has tweeted before not to get rid of billionaires. And that's why they're on mainstream media. So always remember that. I know that was probably a long rant, probably longer than you expected, but I really needed to take the time to break that down. A number of videos that I saw earlier this morning, they were just all the Republican channels, conservative channels were saying he destroys Sonny. And I feel like some of the left channels were just like, she destroyed him. And I don't think there was really any destroying that actually happened in that conversation. I think that both of them brought up good points. I think that Sonny came in a little bit too hot. I think Sonny, you might have had a little too much caffeine in the morning. I don't know, but you could have came in a little bit calmer. But I think they both brought up valid points. And sometimes it's not always about who destroyed who. But I also think it's important that you understand why these people are given the platform that they're given in the first place and where they're actually coming from. And so if I hear Coleman Hughes say that he's against reparations for ADOS, then I want to know if Coleman Hughes is against reparations for Holocaust victims and for the Japanese Americans that were part of the internment camps as well. And I have a feeling he probably would not be against it, at least for the Holocaust victims. Otherwise, he wouldn't be working with Barry Weiss. These things are important. You guys need to know. You guys know where Sonny came from. I didn't talk about this before. Sonny, millionaire. These people make a lot of money. A lot of money. So just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. But in reference to the class and the race issue, class and race is intertwined. And I know some people just want to focus on class and they'll say, let's not talk about race. But if you're telling me don't talk about race, that means you don't want me to talk about me. Because part of who I am and part of what I have to deal with in my life is because of my race. Maybe one day this country could get to a colorblind society, but I don't see it happening anytime soon as long as you still have these structures that are in place right now.